All right, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the concepts from chapter 5 now, and today we're going to talk about supertype and subtypes. I'm going to give you a couple of examples and then talk about some things you need to think about when designing these entities into your database diagrams. So, first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what a supertype is and what a subtype is and why you would want to use one. Um, Basically, what you have is a hierarchy of how things are related when you're using supertypes and subtypes. And so you might have a higher level entity, but then underneath that, you have specialized units of that entity that are going to hold other data. So the example we're going to look at here is we're going to have a person entity, and then we're going to have three different types of people who exist at a university. And the reason you would think about doing this is if you have a person entity where you would store a lot of data that's very similar. So you might store their first name, their last name, their address, their zip code, all their contact information. If you're going to store that for every type of person at the university, you might consider putting that into one table. Now, if you just had a person table, then you would have to have a lot of fields in that table that were specific to the type of person. And so if you had a student listed in here, they might not have their highest degree or their rank listed because they're not a professor. And so throughout your database, you would see a whole lot of empty fields, which is sometimes an indication of a design problem. And so what you can do is you can create a supertype here, which is a person. You can store the data that's common or mostly common between all types of people. And then what you do is you link them through the person type to tables that specifically carry that data. Now, one thing you need to notice first of all is that the primary key and the foreign key of all of these subtypes is the primary key of the supertype. So the primary key for the subtype is inherited from the supertype. Okay, and that's really how you link these things together. Generally speaking, these are going to be one-to-one relationships. That's not necessarily true because you can have overlapping subtypes, and we'll talk about an example of that in a minute. But generally speaking, you're going to tie the person back to this. So, in other words, a person might be a professor and a staff member, but a person will only always be a professor once. And so that's why you're allowed to have that link put into place. So in this example, like I said, we have a person where we have basic contact information stored for them. We would have that stored for all of the people at our university. But then the different types of people at the university might have completely different information stored about them. So just to show you kind of an example, and you'd have probably a lot more than this, but this is just to simplify it. There would be professors at the university, and you would store what their highest degree was, probably because you have to prove to people out there that they're qualified to teach certain subjects and things like that. So you would have that. You wouldn't necessarily have that under a staff member or a student. Rank. Professors at a university or at Tarleton are ranked differently than staff members and students as well. And so you would have something like assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, instructor, things like that. And then this could be a yes, no, whether they're qualified according to accreditation standards. So this ties into the nature of what a professor does at the university. It ties into the fact that they're teaching and that you have to prove to somebody that they're qualified to teach what they are teaching. So the staff member would probably have fewer regulations. They at Tarleton you get longevity pay. So if you're here X number of years, they bump your salary up a little bit. Professors are not eligible for that. Staff members are. So it would be in this table that is specific to staff members. Staff members also accrue vacation. Professors at Tarleton don't accrue vacation. So again, that information would be here. And then job title, which would have a whole lot more variety and probably be pulled from a different table altogether, kind of goes along with the idea of rank. Now, the student is probably the type of person that varies much more than these two do. You would have stuff about admissions. You would have current enrollments. You would have things that are specific to being a student that you wouldn't see in either of these tables. And so this is just an example of how this super type of person is allowed to store basic information. And then when you have specific information to a type of person, then you create these different types of people in their own table and link them back through that shared person ID. So that's one we're going to look at. Now I'm going to look at our product table, kind of a mock-up of our product table from our music store. And so if we wanted to store different information about our products, we could have a basic product table, which would have our stock keeping unit, which is a standardized kind of a code number. So that's what we would use. We'd have a generic description of it. We'd have what the current price is, and maybe for inventory purposes, we'd have what we have on hand. And so this would probably be information that we would store for all products in the store, whether it be an instrument, sheet music, supplies, or whatever. But then again, if I wanted to have more specific information about the product like before, let's take a look at sheet music, for example. I might want to store the composer, the opus, what key it's written in, what instrument it was written in, the publisher, things like that. And those things would not apply to the instruments that I'm selling. The guitar does not have an opus, and supplies don't have composers. And so if I were to put that all into this product table, for all the sheet music, it would be filled out. But anytime an instrument or supplies were entered into our database of the table of products, a lot of those things would be empty. So again, we create this super type of product with a product ID, and we link that to our 3 subtypes here, which have inherited the primary key of product ID from the parent table here. And so again, this allows us to have size, whether they want to take insurance out on their instrument when they buy it, or who is the supplier. The sheet music, again, I mentioned some of the things that you might see on sheet music. And then supplies, you have a vendor and special instructions. So does that mean that for every product type, I have to have a subtype? And the answer is no. And this is really going to be a business decision. It's going to be how you want to store your data, what your customer needs from you. So let's just talk about this real quick. Let's say I have supplies and I have vendor ID and I have special instructions, which is kind of a generic comment field. And I look at that and I say, well, realistically, I have a supplier and I have a publisher and I have a vendor. And those really are all the same thing. So those are all kind of suppliers. So I could go in here and get rid of those and add an attribute to my main table that allows me to have a supplier, which will act as my publisher or my instrument maker or whatever. So I can add that there. And so now I look at this and I think special instructions. Do I want a whole table for just special instructions on supplies? Because realistically, couldn't I just have a comment section that would apply to something else? So if I had to make a comment about a particular instrument, if it was used or something, I don't know. But what I'm looking at is when I start to look at this table, I start to think to myself, well, this really isn't specific to supplies. And so I start to question on whether I actually need a supply table. So if I do think that I need a special instruction, something that's going to print out on their invoice or their receipt when they buy something from me, like if a product needs to be used in, if you're cleaning your violin and you need to use it in an open area, you might need to, do it. You might want to add that to the receipt. But again, there's no reason why I can't just take that and add it to my main table here for product. And then that way, if I have special instructions about an instrument, how to take care of it, or, if I want to just have some sort of it's maybe more likely that I'll use it here than I use it here. And so if I no longer have anything to warrant a subtype of supplies, then that means that I don't need that table. And supplies will just be in the product table and won't have additional information stored about them here. So you don't have to have all of your subtypes. If you think you have a subtype, you really need to ask yourself, is there additional information that is specific to that subtype that needs to be stored? So let's talk about overlapping subtypes. So another design decision you're going to make is you're going to decide on whether your supertype or whether one of your subtypes can be in multiple. So if we stay here and look at product, chances are an instrument is never going to be in the sheet music category, and the sheet music is never going to be in the instrument. So in this case, we would not have overlapping entities. It can be a member of only one. Now, because we have products in the database that don't go in either, we also have another business rule that's controlling the design of our database. We can have products that do not have a subtype, but you're going to need to plan for those and make sure that the data you need is captured. So let's go back to our person supertype, and let's look at this. Can these things overlap? Yes, these can easily overlap. If I decide I want to take an art class just for fun, I am a professor, but then I would overlap in the student table. Staff members can also become students, and depending on the business rules of the university, a staff member could potentially also be a professor. It has to do with how we appoint people and whether we allow dual appointments like that. So again, that would depend completely on how the university runs its business, and a lot of this stuff would come out through your systems analysis and design phases. So this is actually a diagram or a supertype and a subtype that would allow for overlapping categories. And one other thing I want to point out before we end this video is the concept of inheritance. Any relationship that person exists with in the database, these three subtypes automatically inherit that. So if there is a link from person to a pay table or something like that, we don't need to get into the details, but let's say the person table is related to a pay table or something like that, then that would mean that through this person supertype, all of these automatically inherit the relationship between them and the external relationship. But the opposite is not true. A student can have its own relationships that are separate from staff member and professor. And so let me move some things around here just to get a little bit more room in my filming screen. I can come in and I can add another entity here, which is advisor. And this would be my advisor that is going to link to a student, and I would fill all that information in. And now the relationship between this exists, if I can get the relationship tool to come up. I can't get a relationship to come up. Anyway, I'm not sure what's going on. Anyway, what I can do is I can establish a relationship between the student and an advisor, and that relationship would exist only between these two entities. It wouldn't automatically exist between the supertype or the other subtypes, because the relationship between student and advisor makes sense, whereas a relationship between a staff member and an advisor doesn't as much. So that right there is an overview of how the supertype subtype works. There are some good examples in your book. There's also an example of the product concept in the review questions. So if you turn over to page 188, you can take another look at a different approach to the product data model with product supertype, and then book, CD, and movie as subtypes. So we're going to end there, and we're going to move on in our next video to looking at primary keys again, talking about how important they are, and again, just some more tips on choosing your primary keys.